Red Dead Redemption running on the Xbox 360 is actually insane. This was because if you think about what's actually happening on screen, you've got a massive open frontier spanning 3 entire regions. Realistic horse physics, procedural character animations that calculate bone positions in real time, dynamic weather systems, a full day-night cycle. All of this running on a console with a tri-core 3.2 GHz processor and only 512 megabytes of shared RAM, to give you an idea of how tight that is. A single uncompressed texture from a modern game could eat up a significant chunk of that entire memory budget on its own. Rockstar San Diego didn't just push the Xbox 360 to its limit with this game. They essentially built an elaborate system of illusions, sacrifices, engineering tricks just to keep it from falling apart completely. The sheer scale of what Rockstar was attempting here is hard to overstate. Development started around 2005 and ramped into full production in 2006, with a core team of about 180 people at Rockstar San Diego, eventually pulling in support from 4 other Rockstar studios. When all was said and done, over 1,000 developers had touched this project at some point. The estimated combined budget for development and marketing landed somewhere between $80 and $100 million. That at the time put it among the most expensive games ever made. And what were they all trying to build? Essentially a Grand Theft Auto-scale open world, but set in the American West, where instead of dense city blocks full of geometry you could hide things behind, you had open plains, canyons, desert stretching to the horizon in every direction. That's a fundamentally harder problem to solve on limited hardware. The engine powering all of this was Rockstar's own Rage system, which stands for Rockstar Advanced Game Engine. And what made Rage special wasn't just that it could render nice-looking environments. It was specifically designed around the problem of seamless world streaming, meaning the game had to constantly load and unload assets in the background as you moved through the world without you ever seeing a loading screen. Think of it like reading a book where someone is constantly tearing out the pages you've already read and taping in new ones ahead of you, all while you're still reading. That's essentially what Rage was doing with the Xbox 360's memory every single second you were riding across New Austin. And it had to do this while also running physics, AI, weather, and animations at the same time. The Xbox 360's tri-core CPU was actually one of the biggest bottlenecks the developers had to work around. 3 cores sounds reasonable until you realize how many things needed to run simultaneously. You had the streaming engine constantly calculating what to load next, the physics engine handling horse movement and ragdoll reactions, the AI systems managing NPC behavior across the whole visible world, the rendering pipeline pushing frames to the screen. Rockstar had to carefully distribute all of those workloads across those 3 cores without any one of them becoming so overloaded that the frame rate collapsed. The optimization required to pull this off across a world this size was genuinely extraordinary. Most studios at the time simply didn't have the expertise or resources to attempt. The DVD drive on the Xbox 360 was another serious problem. This is where things get almost embarrassing for the hardware. Reading data off a DVD is a physical process. There's a laser that has to physically move across the disc to find the data it needs. In a normal linear game, this isn't a huge issue because the data is read mostly in sequence. But in an open world game where you can move in any direction at any speed, the drive has to constantly jump around the disc, hunting for whatever assets are needed next. For Red Dead Redemption, with its massive regions full of unique terrain, vegetation, character models, that laser was working constantly. Rockstar had to carefully organize data on the disc itself to minimize how far the laser had to travel between reads. This was because every unnecessary jump added latency to the streaming pipeline and threatened to cause pop-in or frame drops. The vegetation system is a perfect example of where you can see the engineering trade-offs in action. If you compare the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions side by side, the 360 version actually renders more polygons, more shrubs, more environmental detail than the PS3 version, even though both consoles were running at the same 30 frames per second target. The 360 version also ran at 720p versus roughly 640p on PS3. What this tells you is that Rockstar essentially optimized each version independently rather than just porting one to the other. They found different headroom in each console's architecture and exploited it differently. The PS3 won on load times, the Xbox 360 won on visual fidelity, but neither version could have the best of both without the hardware simply refusing to cooperate. One of the most technically ambitious things in the entire game was the Euphoria animation system that Rockstar licensed from a company called Natural Motion. Most games at this time handled character animation by playing pre-recorded animation clips. You push an NPC, the game plays the falling animation it already recorded in a studio. Euphoria didn't work that way. Instead, it used real-time physics simulations to generate animations procedurally based on what was actually happening in the scene. When John Marston got knocked off his horse, when an enemy stumbled after being shot, when a character lost their balance on uneven terrain, game, Euphoria was calculating bone positions, joint angles, muscular responses on the fly. That's a completely different and far more demanding approach, and it was running on a decade-old console processor. The horse riding specifically was where Euphoria's demands became most visible. When you rode across flat plains versus steep mountain terrain, the horse's animation would subtly shift to account for the incline. The way Marston's body responded to the horse's movements changed depending on speed and conditions. None of that was a pre-baked clip. It was all calculated in real time, and because this required constant CPU processing for every character on screen, the developers had to build in a level of detail system for the physics calculations themselves, not just the visuals. Distant NPCs got simplified physics. Characters close to the player got the full Euphoria treatment. If you'd applied full physics simulation to every person in a crowded town simultaneously, the CPU would have simply given up. Memory management for the open world followed a similar logic to what Rockstar had done with GTA San Andreas, but on a much larger scale and with more complex assets. The three main regions of the game, New Austin, West Elizabeth, Nuevo Paraíso, each had distinct visual identities with unique terrain types, vegetation, and architecture. The engine had to predict where you were going and start loading those assets before you actually arrived, while simultaneously unloading everything behind you to free up RAM. If you've ever been riding at full gallop and suddenly turned your horse around, you might have caught a split second where distant terrain hadn't fully rendered yet. That was the streaming system caught slightly off guard by an unexpected direction change. The NPC population system had its own clever tricks built in to survive the memory budget. Each region of the world had a limited pool of character models that the game would load and then reuse throughout that area. Towns like Armadillo or Escalera didn't actually have hundreds of unique individuals walking around. They had a smaller set of models that the engine recycled with slight color and accessory variations to create the illusion of variety. It came from the same place, a RAM budget that simply couldn't afford to store dozens of fully unique character models simultaneously. What feels like a living, breathing frontier is actually a carefully managed rotation of repeated assets dressed up just enough to avoid being obvious about it. The atmosphere and draw distance in the game also serve a double purpose that most players never think about. The heat haze over the desert, the dusty horizon over the plains, the fog rolling through the swamps of Thieves Landing. All of that looks like deliberate artistic direction, and it is, but it's also doing engineering work. The draw distance on Xbox 360 hardware had real limits. If the game showed you a perfectly clear, unlimited view across New Austin, you'd see exactly where the world ends, that hard edge where the terrain simply doesn't exist yet. The atmospheric effects push that horizon back visually, while the streaming engine races to fill in what's actually beyond it. The art direction and the engineering are solving the same problem from two different directions at the same time. The result is that the game just looks beautiful while hiding its own limitations inside that beauty. What makes all of this even more impressive is that despite everything the hardware was struggling with under the surface, the experience on the player side felt seamless. Reviews at the time described it as a technical marvel, praising the visual effects, the background loading, the overall stability of the world. The frame rate held at roughly 30 frames per second with almost no screen tearing across both platforms. There were small frame drops occasionally, but nothing that broke the experience. For a game of this scale running on 7th generation hardware, that level of stability didn't happen by accident. It was the product of years of optimization work across every single system in the engine simultaneously, from how the DVD data was laid out to how physics calculations were distributed across CPU cores. And honestly, when you strip back all the technical language, what Rockstar San Diego actually delivered was a fully functional open-world western, with realistic animations, seamless streaming, dynamic weather, a living NPC population, all running on a console that by the time the game launched in 2010 was already 5 years old. The team of over 1,000 developers, the 5-year development cycle, the $100 million budget, all of that translated into an experience that made the hardware look far more capable than it actually was. So what do you guys think about this one? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. That was it for today's video. Subscribing would be really appreciated. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.